It was Christmas Eve, 1983. I remember the chill in the air and the way the snow blanketed the streets, making everything seem quiet, too quiet. I had wandered into a small, dimly lit bar, nursing a drink and a heart heavy with loneliness. It was supposed to be just another forgettable night. But then I saw him, Andrew. He wasn't like anyone I'd ever met, and I certainly wasn't looking for him, or for what would come next. What started that night would take us on a journey through love, pain, and triumph, a path filled with moments that tested us to our very core. Now, 40 years later, I sit here, thinking about every choice, every fight, and every joy we shared. I often wonder if people really understand what it means to love against all odds. Let me tell you our story, how it began, how it nearly fell apart, and how it became something neither of us could have ever imagined. The snow was falling steadily that night, soft and unrelenting, as if the heavens were trying to blanket the world in silence. I had been walking aimlessly, my breath visible in the icy air, and my thoughts heavier than the dark clouds overhead. Christmas Eve was supposed to be a time of joy and celebration, but for me, it had always been a cruel reminder of what I lacked: family, connection, love. So, when I stumbled upon that unassuming little bar at the edge of the city, its warm yellow light spilling onto the snow-covered sidewalk, I pushed the door open without hesitation. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the faint hum of conversation. A jukebox played an old holiday tune, but the irony of it only deepened my mood. I slid onto a stool at the bar, ordered a whiskey neat, and tried to drown out the laughter from the corner table where a group of strangers celebrated as if they had everything in the world. My heart felt like an anchor, dragging me deeper into my own solitude. That's when I saw him. He was sitting at the far end of the bar, nursing what looked like a gin and tonic. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his face a mix of ruggedness and gentleness that I couldn't quite reconcile. He wasn't laughing or talking with anyone, just sitting there, staring into his glass as if it held the answers to some unspoken question. I don't know why I couldn't look away. Maybe it was the way his eyes glimmered under the dim lights, or the way his shoulders slumped, mirroring the weight I felt in my own chest. All I knew was that he wasn't like the others. For a moment, I debated whether to say something. What if he brushed me off? What if he thought I was pathetic? But the whiskey had dulled my fears just enough, so I got up and walked over, my heart pounding louder than the music. "Mind if I sit here?" I asked, gesturing to the stool beside him. He looked up, startled, as if I had pulled him out of some deep thought. His eyes were a piercing blue, and they met mine with an intensity that made me forget how to breathe. Then he smiled, a small, hesitant smile that felt like the first ray of sunlight after a long, bitter winter. "Not at all," he said, his voice soft but steady. I sat down, suddenly hyper-aware of everything. The distance between us, the way his cologne mingled with the scent of whiskey and pine, the nervous energy crackling in the air. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything, and I wondered if I had made a mistake. "Rough night?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. I let out a bitter laugh. "Something like that. Christmas has never been my thing." He nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "Same here. Too much pressure to be happy, don't you think?" "Exactly," I said. surprised at how easily he had put my feelings into words. We talked for what felt like hours, about everything and nothing. His name was Andrew, and he had grown up in a small town not far from where we were. He told me about his love for literature, his dream of becoming a teacher, and the struggles he faced being himself in a world that wasn't ready to accept him. I told him about my own battles, how I had left home at 18 after my parents found out I was gay, how I had spent the past few years drifting from city to city, trying to find a place where I could just be. There was something about Andrew that felt different from anyone I had ever met. He listened, really listened, and when he spoke, his words carried a warmth that thawed the icy walls I had built around my heart. By the time the bartender announced last call, I realized I didn't want the night to end. "Do you want to get some coffee?" I asked, nervousness creeping back into my voice. Andrew hesitated, glancing at the clock above the bar. For a moment, I thought he was going to say no, but then he smiled again. That same small, hesitant smile that had drawn me to him in the first place. "Yeah," he said, "I'd like that." We left the bar together, stepping out into the quiet, snow-covered streets. The city felt different now. Less lonely, less cold. We walked side by side, talking and laughing as if we had known each other for years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. And as we sat in a tiny diner, sipping hot coffee and sharing pieces of ourselves, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night was the beginning of something extraordinary. What I didn't know then was just how extraordinary it would be, or how much we would have to fight to keep it. But in that moment, with Andrew sitting across from me and the snow falling softly outside, I allowed myself to hope. And for the first time, hope didn't feel so far out of reach. Andrew and I spent hours in that diner, the kind of hours that make time irrelevant. The snowstorm outside thickened, but inside, we were warm, insulated by the connection growing between us. When the waitress gave us a pointed look as she wiped down the counter for the fourth time, we realized the night was nearly over. Neither of us wanted to part ways, though neither of us was bold enough to say it outright. "Where do you live?" Andrew asked, breaking the lull in our conversation. "Not far," I replied, "a couple blocks east." "I'm further uptown. Would it be okay if I walked you home?" His tone was careful, as if he feared he might overstep. I nodded, a quiet excitement stirring within me. No one had ever asked to walk me home before. It was a gesture that felt almost old-fashioned, but coming from Andrew, it felt like something out of a romance novel. A story I never believed could belong to someone like me. The streets were eerily quiet as we walked, our footsteps crunching against the snow. Our breath formed clouds in the freezing air, but the cold barely registered. Every now and then, our arms would brush, sending sparks up my spine. I kept stealing glances at him, marveling at how open and genuine he seemed. For once, I didn't feel like I had to hide. When we reached my building, I hesitated at the door, reluctant to let the night end. Andrew lingered too, his hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets, his face shadowed by the dim streetlight. "I had a really good time tonight," he said, his voice soft but earnest. "Me too," I replied, suddenly nervous. "Thanks for walking me home?" "Of course." He paused, his blue eyes searching mine. "Do you think we could do this again? Sometime soon?" The question hung in the air, filled with possibility. I felt a rare warmth bloom in my chest, something close to joy. "Yeah, I'd like that." We exchanged numbers, a simple act that felt monumental. And then, before I could think too much about it, I leaned in and kissed his cheek. It was quick, barely a brush, but when I pulled back, I saw a shy smile, a smile that I would later come to know as distinctly Andrew. That night, I fell asleep with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. But the days that followed would quickly remind me that the world didn't make space for men like us. Andrew called me the very next day, and we made plans to meet for dinner later that week. Everything felt easy with him, as if we had skipped the awkwardness and gone straight to understanding each other. But as our connection deepened, so did the reality of what it meant to be together. On our third date, we decided to meet at a small Italian restaurant tucked away in the quieter part of the city. We were seated near the back, where the lighting was dim, and the other patrons seemed more interested in their wine than in us. It was the perfect place for two men who didn't want to draw attention. But halfway through the meal, as Andrew reached across the table to brush a stray strand of hair from my face, I noticed the waiter giving us a look. It was fleeting but sharp, a mixture of disdain and disbelief. My stomach sank and I withdrew slightly, pretending to adjust my napkin. Andrew noticed. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. When the bill came, the waiter's coldness was impossible to ignore. He slapped it down on the table without a word and walked away without making eye contact. Andrew's jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of anger in his usually calm demeanor. "Don't let it get to you," I said quietly, though my voice betrayed my own unease. "Why should we have to put up with this?" he replied, his voice low but firm. "We're not doing anything wrong." I wanted to agree, but fear had been my constant companion for so long that it felt easier to stay quiet. That night, as we walked back to his apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that being with Andrew might make life harder, not just for me, but for him too. And yet, when he held my hand as we crossed the icy streets, I knew I wasn't ready to let go. Our love grew quickly, but so did the challenges. Andrew's family, though polite on the surface, made it clear they disapproved of his choices. His father barely acknowledged me during the one dinner Andrew invited me to, and his mother avoided the topic altogether, steering conversations towards safer, neutral ground. My own parents were even less subtle. When they found out about Andrew, they left me a scathing voicemail. "We didn't raise you for this kind of life." After that, we didn't speak for years. Andrew and I leaned on each other during those early days, but the weight of the world around us began to seep into our relationship. Little things turned into arguments, and doubts crept in where there had once been certainty. "Do you think this is worth it?" I asked him one night, my voice cracking under the weight of my insecurities. Andrew's eyes softened, and he took my hands in his. "I don't just think it's worth it. I know it is, but we have to fight for it, together." His words anchored me, but I couldn't shake the fear that the world would eventually win. Still, as we lay in his tiny apartment that night, his arms wrapped tightly around me, I made a silent promise. I would fight for us no matter what it took. Little did I know how much we would be tested in the years to come. The winter months passed, and with them came moments of pure joy. Nights spent in Andrew's cramped apartment, sharing dreams and laughter as snow fell quietly outside. We talked about everything: his ambition to become a teacher, my hope of one day starting a small business, and the places we wanted to see together. For a while, it felt like we had built our own little world. a sanctuary untouched by the ugliness outside. But that illusion couldn't last forever. Spring arrived, and with it came new tensions. Andrew had landed a job as a substitute teacher, a stepping stone toward his dream. But his new position also brought scrutiny. One day, I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at a crumpled piece of paper in his hands. "What's that?" I asked, sitting beside him. He hesitated before handing it to me. It was a handwritten note, barely legible, scrawled in angry red ink. "We don't need faggots teaching our kids. Leave now, or we'll make you." I felt a cold wave of anger and fear wash over me. "Who sent this?" "I don't know," Andrew said quietly. "It was left in my classroom. We have to report this." He shook his head. "To who? The principal? The police? Do you think they'll care? Or worse, make it worse for me?" I didn't have an answer. The helplessness was suffocating. I wanted to fight for him, to protect him, but I also knew how dangerous that could be. Andrew had grown up with stories of men beaten for being too open, too bold. He had always been cautious, and now I understood why. The tension didn't stop there. One night, we were walking home from a movie when we passed a group of men loitering near a corner store. They didn't say anything at first, just stared at us as we walked by. But then one of them muttered something loud enough to hear. "Disgusting." I felt Andrew's hand tighten around mine. "Keep walking," he whispered. But I couldn't. Something inside me snapped. I stopped, turning to face them. "You have a problem?" The man smirked, stepping closer. "Yeah, I do. Guys like you think you can flaunt your sickness anywhere you want." "Let's go," Andrew urged, pulling at my arm. But I was too angry. "We're not bothering you. Just leave us alone." The man's smirk turned into a sneer, and his friends closed in. "Or what?" Andrew finally stepped between us, his voice calm but firm. "We're leaving. Come on, Adam." Reluctantly, I followed him, my hands trembling with adrenaline and fear. As we turned the corner, I heard one of them yell, "Watch your backs, queers!" The words hung in the air, a reminder of how much the world hated us simply for existing. When we got home, Andrew didn't speak for a long time. He just sat on the couch staring at the floor. Finally, he said, "You can't do that again." What was I supposed to do? Let them talk to us like that? "Yes," he said, his voice sharp. "Because it's not just words. It's threats. And threats can turn into something worse." His frustration was palpable, but so was mine. "I'm tired of being afraid, Andrew. Aren't you?" "Of course I am," he said, his voice softening. "But being brave doesn't mean being reckless. I can't lose you, Adam. I won't." His words broke through my anger, leaving only a deep ache in my chest. I sat beside him, taking his hand in mine. "I don't want to lose you either." Despite the challenges, we tried to hold on to the good moments. We started going to a local gay bar on weekends, a place where we could dance, laugh, and be ourselves without fear of judgment. For a few hours each week, we were surrounded by people who understood us, who made us feel less alone. It was a lifeline, but even that wasn't without its risks. One night, as we left the bar, we noticed a group of men loitering across the street. They were shouting slurs at the patrons leaving the bar, their voices dripping with malice. Andrew grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a nearby alley. "We'll take the back way," he said. But before we could slip away, one of the men spotted us. "Hey, you two. Got something to say?" Andrew quickened his pace, but the men followed, their laughter echoing in the narrow alley. My heart raced as I heard their footsteps closing in, Andrew pulled me into a shadowed doorway, pressing a finger to his lips. We held our breath as the men passed, their voices fading into the distance. When we finally stepped back onto the main street, my knees felt weak. Andrew wrapped his arms around me, holding me close. "We're okay," he whispered, though his voice trembled. But were we? The fear and hatred were everywhere, a constant shadow over our lives. That night, as I lay in Andrew's arms, I couldn't stop wondering if we would ever truly be safe, or if the world would always find a way to tear us apart.
As the months passed, the weight of the world began to press harder against us. Andrew and I tried to hold on to the happiness we found in each other, but the constant fear and tension were like a slow poison. Our once effortless connection started to feel strained, the cracks in our foundation becoming harder to ignore. It started with little things. Andrew would come home from work, exhausted and distant, barely speaking over dinner. I, in turn, became short-tempered, snapping at him for things that didn't really matter. We were fighting more often, and even though the arguments were over trivial things, the hurt they left behind lingered. One night, after an especially heated argument about his long hours at work, Andrew finally broke. "Do you think this is easy for me?" he said, his voice louder than I'd ever heard it. "Do you think I enjoy coming home feeling like I'm barely holding everything together?" I stared at him, taken aback. "I'm not asking you to carry everything alone, Andrew, but you shut me out. How am I supposed to help if you won't let me in?" His shoulders slumped, and the fire in his eyes dulled. I'm scared at him. Every day I feel like I'm walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and I lose everything, my job, my safety, us. The vulnerability in his voice broke my heart. I reached for him, and he let me pull him into an embrace. "We'll figure it out," I whispered. "Together." But as much as I wanted to believe my own words, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around us were closing in. The turning point came one evening when Andrew received a call from his mother. I watched as he paced the living room, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. When he hung up, he sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting beside him. "She invited me to a family dinner next weekend," he said without looking up. "But she made it clear you're not welcome." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What did you say?" "I told her I wouldn't go without you." "And?" "She said if I bring you, it's better if I don't come at all." The bitterness in his voice was palpable, and I could feel my own anger rising. "You shouldn't have to choose between me and your family, Andrew. That's not fair." "Nothing about this is fair, Adam," he said, his voice tight. "But they're my family. I can't just cut them off." "So what are you going to do?" He didn't answer, and the silence that followed was deafening. The dinner happened without me. Andrew went, despite his promise, and when he returned that night, he was quieter than I'd ever seen him. He didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. But the distance between us grew, a chasm that neither of us seemed able to cross. Our fights became more frequent, and our moments of joy fewer and farther between. One night, after another argument that left us both in tears, Andrew said something that shook me to my core. "Maybe we're just too different," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, my chest tightening. "What are you saying?" "I don't know," he admitted. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbearable. For the first time, I wondered if the love we had fought so hard to protect might not be enough to save us. The next few days were a blur of silence and avoidance. Andrew stayed late at work, and I spent more time out of the apartment, wandering the city aimlessly. I felt like I was losing him, like the foundation we had built was crumbling beneath us. One evening, as I walked through the park near our apartment, I found myself sitting on a bench, staring at the frozen pond. The memories of our early days together flooded back. The laughter, the stolen glances, the way his touch had made me feel alive. I realized then how much I had taken those moments for granted and how much I still loved him despite everything. When I returned home, Andrew was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a word, I crossed the room and sat beside him. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking, "for everything." He looked at me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, too. I never wanted it to get this hard." "It's hard because it matters," I said, reaching for his hand. "And I don't want to lose you, Andrew. I can't." For the first time in weeks, he smiled. A small, hesitant smile that reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with. "I don't want to lose you either." We sat there for hours, talking about everything we had been too afraid to say. By the time we went to bed, the weight that had been pressing on us felt a little lighter. But I knew that our fight wasn't over. The world outside hadn't changed, and neither had the challenges we faced. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we might actually stand a chance. Despite our heartfelt reconciliation, life didn't make things easier. Andrew's job became increasingly hostile. A parent lodged a formal complaint against him, citing moral concerns. It was a thinly veiled attack on his sexuality, but Andrew refused to back down. "I've worked too hard for this," he told me, his voice trembling with frustration. But the toll it took on him was undeniable. He was quieter at home, more withdrawn, and I felt helpless watching the man I loved being worn down. The weight of the world pressed harder, and I feared it was more than we could bear. One summer, Andrew suggested a trip to a secluded cabin in the woods. "Just us," he said, his eyes pleading. It was the first time in months that I saw a flicker of the man I had fallen in love with. Those few days were magical. We swam in the lake, cooked meals together, and talked late into the night. For a brief moment, it felt like the world couldn't touch us. But reality loomed, waiting to pull us back into its unforgiving grasp. Upon returning home, things took a darker turn. Someone spray-painted a slur on the wall outside our apartment building. Andrew found it first and spent hours scrubbing it off before I came home. He didn't want me to see it, but the pain in his eyes told me everything. "I can't keep doing this," he said that night, his voice breaking. "I'm so tired, Adam." "We'll get through it," I assured him, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Our breaking point came one evening when Andrew came home, trembling with rage. He had been fired. "They didn't even bother hiding it," he said, his voice thick with tears. "They said it was a performance issue." I held him as he cried, and for the first time, I saw how deeply he had been hurt by the world's cruelty. But instead of breaking us, it united us. We decided to leave the city and start over somewhere new. It was a leap of faith, but it was the only way forward. We moved to a small town where no one knew us, where we could build a life without the constant fear of judgment.
Andrew became a private tutor, and I opened a small bookshop. Our days were simple, but they were ours. Now, sitting here in this quiet nursing home, I think about those years often. Andrew isn't with me anymore, but his presence lingers in every memory, every smile, every fight we endured together. Love didn't erase the pain, but it made the fight worthwhile. And if I could do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing. Hey everyone, what did you think of today's emotional story? It's been a journey full of love, challenges, and triumph, hasn't it? We'd love to hear your thoughts. What score would you give this story on a scale from 1 to 10? Don't forget to drop a comment sharing what touched your heart the most. And if you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Share it with your friends and family. You might just inspire someone today. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next one.